The first time my son looked ashamed of me. He was standing beneath a white rose arch with 200 guests waiting behind him, and a string quartet playing something gentle enough to make cruelty sound polite. He did not raise his voice. That almost made it worse. He just stepped in front of me, straightened his cufflinks, and said, "Dad, you're not seated with family." I remember the smell of lilies, the shine of the marble floor, and the way the wedding planner froze when I handed her that envelope. 20 minutes later, his bride opened it upstairs. When she saw my name, every drop of color left her face. That morning had started with hope. I was 67 years old enough to know better than to expect perfect days, but foolish enough to believe a father might still have a place at his only son's wedding. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to get my tie straight. 40 years of fixing commercial heating systems will teach a man patience, but that tie gave me trouble. It was navy blue, the same one Margaret bought me before she got sick. She had said it made me look distinguished. I told her distinguished was just a polite word for old. Margaret had been gone 5 years, but grief keeps certain voices alive. That morning, I could almost hear her behind me. "Stand tall, Tom. It is Daniel's day." So I stood tall. My suit was not new, but it was clean and pressed. My shoes were polished. I slipped Margaret's wedding ring into my jacket pocket. I only wanted to give it to Daniel quietly before the ceremony. The venue sat outside Nashville, a restored country estate with white columns, old oak trees, and lights strung across the lawn like fallen stars. At the gate, a sign read, "Whitmore Walker Wedding." I looked at that sign for a moment longer than necessary. Walker came second. I told myself not to be petty. Then I pulled forward. A valet looked at my Ford pickup like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. I let him park it anyway. A man should not begin his son's wedding by apologizing for the truck that paid for his childhood. Near the front doors, a woman with a clipboard greeted guests. Her name tag said Marcia Bell, wedding planner. Name, Sir Thomas Walker. Her eyes moved down to the list, then back up to my face. Recognition flashed there for half a second before professionalism covered it. "Mr. Walker," she said carefully. "Welcome." Before she could say anything else, I saw Daniel. He came through the open doorway in a black tuxedo. His face was tight, not nervous groomed tight, guilty tight. "Dad," he said, walking fast. I smiled because I was glad to see him. That is the part I hate remembering. "Daniel," I said, "you look good." "Son." "Thanks." He glanced behind him. "Can I talk to you for a second?" He led me near a tall arrangement of white roses. Through the ballroom doors, I could see tables dressed in ivory linen. At the front were 2 long family tables. One of them had a small framed photo of Margaret beside a candle. For a second, my throat tightened. Daniel saw me looking and shifted his weight. "Dad," he said quietly, "there's been a seating change." A seating change. Claire's mom had to adjust some things last minute. I waited. Men my age learn that silence is sometimes the only tool left that still works. Daniel swallowed. "You're at table 19. Table 19 was near the rear doors, close to the service hallway. The kind of table where people put guests nobody knows how to explain. I looked back at him. Am I not sitting with family? His face twitched. That was the moment. A man can prepare a lie, but his body often tells the truth a second too early. "Dad," he said, "you're not seated with family." The music kept playing. Somewhere behind us, a woman laughed. A server walked by carrying champagne flutes. I felt strangely calm. "Why?" I asked. Daniel exhaled hard, as if my question were the rude part. "Please don't make this into something." I asked why. He looked toward the bridal suite hallway. "Claire just wants today to look a certain way." I stared at my son, the child I carried through a fever, the teenager I taught to change a tire, the young man whose tuition I paid by taking emergency calls at 2 in the morning. "A certain way," I said. He leaned closer. "Her family has important people here. Business partners, donors. Grant is trying to close a deal this weekend. He said the front table needs to look clean for pictures, and I would make it look dirty." Daniel closed his eyes. "Dad, there are many ways for a child to say yes without using the word." I looked past him again. Margaret's picture sat beside that candle. There was no empty chair beside it. No place saved. Does Claire know? I asked. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. That was answer enough. I nodded slowly. I see. Relief crossed his face. Actual relief. That hurt more than the insult. Thank you, he whispered. I knew you'd understand. I almost laughed. People often mistake restraint for agreement when they count on your love to keep you quiet. I reached into my jacket pocket. My fingers brushed Margaret's ring first, then the cream-colored envelope beside it. I took out the envelope and turned back toward Marcia. Miss, Bell, I said. She stepped forward. Yes, Mr. Walker. Would you please give this to Claire before the reception starts? Daniel frowned. Dad, what is that? Nothing that will disturb the ceremony. Marcia accepted the envelope. Her eyes dropped to the front. It was addressed simply, Claire Whitmore. Below that, in smaller letters, I had written, from Thomas E. Walker, trustee. Marcia looked up at me. Of course, she said quietly. Daniel stared at the envelope, then at me. Dad, are you leaving? I looked once more at Margaret's picture through the ballroom doors. No, I said. I was already left out. Then I turned and walked back toward the parking lot. I did not rush. I did not look behind me. The music grew softer with every step. By the time I reached my truck, the guests were being asked to take their seats. Mine was still empty, just not the one in the back. I drove away from my son's wedding with both hands on the wheel, and no music playing. There are moments when silence is not empty. It is crowded. Mine was crowded with Daniel's voice, with Margaret's picture beside that candle, with the relief on my son's face when he realized I was not going to embarrass him by asking to be treated like his father. The road out of Ashford Oaks curved through old trees and white ribbon tied to wooden posts. Rain gathered on the windshield in soft, uneven drops. 10 minutes later, I pulled into a small diner off the highway. I sat in the farthest booth from the door. A waitress with gray hair and kind eyes looked at my suit, then at my face, and did not ask any questions. My name is Thomas Walker. Most people call me Tom. For 38 years, I ran Walker Commercial Maintenance out of Nashville. We started with one used van, 2 toolboxes, and a phone in my kitchen. By the time I retired, we had service contracts with hotels, schools, warehouses, and municipal buildings nobody else wanted. I was never flashy. I did not buy boats. I did not collect watches. Margaret and I lived in the same brick ranch house for 31 years. She planted hydrangeas along the front walk. I fixed the fence every spring and complained about it every spring. We were not poor. We were careful. There is a difference. Daniel grew up never understanding that difference. That was partly my fault. I wanted him to have clean shoes, good schools, and a childhood without the constant arithmetic of working-class fear. Margaret used to warn me. Tom, she would say, if you remove every struggle from a boy's life, don't be surprised when he thinks comfort is his birthright. She was usually right about things like that. After she got sick, she talked about Daniel's future more than her own. One evening, maybe 2 months before she passed, she held my hand in that quiet hospital room and said, "Promise me you'll stand tall at his wedding, Tom, even if I'm not there." "I promise," I said. She smiled and saved me a chair. That was Margaret. Even dying, she could make grief sit up straight and behave itself. When Daniel got engaged to Claire Whitmore, Margaret had been gone 4 years. He called me on a Tuesday night. I was sitting at my kitchen table eating leftover chili from a plastic container. She said, "Yes, Dad," he told me. I closed my eyes and thanked God for giving my son some happiness. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Is she kind?" There was a pause, not long, just long enough for a father to notice. "She's great, Dad," he said. I wanted to believe him, so I did. The wedding expenses started small. A deposit here, a vendor problem there. Daniel told me Claire's parents were handling the big pieces, but things were temporarily tight. Grant Whitmore had money tied up in development projects. Evelyn wanted the day to be perfect. Claire was stressed. Daniel hated asking, But could I maybe help cover the venue deposit until Grant's funds cleared? I said yes before he finished explaining. Not because I was foolish, because he was my son. That first check was $12,000. Then came the caterer balance. Then the floral overage. Then the upgraded bourbon bar Grant had apparently promised to business associates. Each time Daniel sounded ashamed. Each time I told him not to worry. Finally, my attorney Denise Porter called me into her office. Denise was a calm woman in her early 60s with silver hair, reading glasses, and the kind of patience that made dishonest people uncomfortable. She had handled my estate documents after Margaret died. She knew where every account sat, which properties were under which trust, and which relatives should never be given direct access to anything sharper than a butter knife. "Tom," she said, sliding a folder across her desk, "you are not helping with a wedding anymore. You are underwriting one. I can afford it." "I know you can. That is not my concern. What is whether your son understands the difference between generosity and entitlement?" I did not answer. Denise let that silence sit for a moment. Then she opened another folder. "There is something else. The venue. Ashford Oaks had once been part of a distressed property package. Years earlier, my company invested in a partnership that bought failing properties, repaired them, and leased them back into use. Ashford Oaks was one of those properties. A beautiful old estate with serious plumbing problems, rotten subflooring, and more charm than financial sense. Over time, investors died. Shares transferred, debts were settled. By the end, my family trust held the controlling interest. I did not run the wedding venue. I did not choose flowers or linen colors. But legally, when serious decisions needed approval, my name mattered. That was why Marcia Bell recognized me. Denise insisted that further wedding payments go through the Walker Family Trust, properly documented. She said if I was going to protect Daniel from embarrassment, I should at least protect myself from confusion later. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now, sitting alone in that diner with wedding music still echoing somewhere in my head, I understood she had simply been paying attention. The envelope Marcia carried upstairs contained just enough truth. The final invoice. The trust authorization. A letter from Denise confirming Ashford Oaks accepted the wedding only after I personally guaranteed the unpaid balances, when Grant Whitmore's second check failed to clear. And my note to Claire. I had written it the night before, though I had hoped I would never need it. "Claire, if this day is full of love, then no document in this envelope will matter. If it is full of appearances, then you should know whose name is holding the room together." My coffee sat untouched as my phone buzzed on the table. Daniel. I watched it ring until it stopped. I let Daniel's call go to voicemail. That sounds colder than it felt. The truth was, if I answered right then, I might have said something a father cannot take back. Not something loud, not profanity. Worse than that, something honest before it had cooled enough to be useful. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. "Dad, where did you go?" I looked at those 5 words for a long time. They were almost funny in a sad way. A son can move his father to the back of his own wedding and still feel surprised when the man does not stay to applaud. I turned the phone face down and stared out the diner window. Rain had started tapping against the glass, soft at first, then harder. Across the highway, the wedding estate sat hidden behind trees and money. Somewhere inside that building, my son was likely standing in front of 200 people, promising to honor and cherish a woman who had let him hide his own father beside the service doors. I did not blame Claire for everything. That would have been too simple. Life is rarely kind enough to put all the rot in one board. Daniel had chosen this. Maybe he was pressured. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he thought a quiet old man in an old suit would be easier to disappoint than a room full of new in-laws. That was the part I could not get past. He knew I would absorb it. Children learn where the soft places are in their parents. Good children protect them. Weak children use them. The signs had been there all week. At the rehearsal dinner, I arrived 10 minutes early with a bottle of wine Margaret used to like. The restaurant was one of those modern southern places with exposed brick expensive cornbread, and menus that needed explanations. Grant Whitmore stood near the bar holding court in a white dinner jacket, laughing loudly enough for people across the room to know he was important. He saw me and smiled the way men smile when they have already decided you are beneath them. "Tom," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder too hard, "good to see you made it. I wasn't sure if this place had parking for work trucks." A few people chuckled, not cruelly. Maybe. Sometimes people laugh because silence would require courage. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. "It does," I said. "Your daughter's florist used one to unload the centerpieces." His smile tightened. Daniel heard it. I saw him hear it. He did not defend me. He just adjusted his tie and introduced me to one of Claire's cousins as my dad. Tom, not father of the groom, not the man who helped make this possible, just Tom. That evening, I was seated beside an insurance agent from Knoxville and a woman who thought I worked for the venue. She asked if I knew when the valet stand closed. I told her I did not. Daniel and Claire sat at the center table with Grant and Evelyn. There was a framed photograph of Margaret near Daniel's elbow. I watched him ignore it for most of the meal. During dessert, I walked over to him quietly. "Did you save your mother's chair for tomorrow?" I asked. Daniel looked toward Claire. Claire looked toward her mother. Evelyn smiled without warmth. "We're still finalizing the seating flow." Evelyn said, "There are photography considerations." Photography considerations. Margaret had held that boy through ear infections, school failures, and the night his first girlfriend broke his heart. Now her place at his wedding depended on camera angles. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad, we'll figure it out tomorrow." I wanted to press him. Instead, I nodded. On the drive home, I told myself weddings make people strange. I told myself Claire was stressed. I told myself Daniel was trying to keep peace. Fathers are experts at building excuses for children who should have grown past needing them. The truth was more specific than that. Grant had been pressing Daniel hard for weeks. He had promised to bring Daniel into a new commercial development venture after the wedding, a polished position with a vice president title Daniel had not earned, but desperately wanted. Grant told him investors would be at the wedding. He told him perception mattered. He told him men like me made rich people uncomfortable because we reminded them money can come from dirty hands. Daniel repeated none of this to me directly, but a father hears what hides beneath a son's careful words. The next morning, while I was knotting the navy tie, a text came in. "Dad, when you get here, please don't make a scene about seating. Claire is stressed." I read it once, then again. "Please don't make a scene." Those words did something quiet and permanent inside me. He had already decided there would be something for me to object to. He knew the disrespect was waiting. He was not asking me to avoid causing trouble. He was asking me to participate politely in my own removal. Still, I went. I went because Margaret would have gone. I went because I had promised. I went because a father should not have to be invited twice to his only son's wedding. When I reached Ashford Oaks, I saw the family table through the open ballroom doors. White flowers, gold chargers, crystal glasses, Margaret's photograph beside a candle. Beautiful, careful, empty. No chair beside her. That image stayed with me more than Daniel's words. A missing chair can be louder than an insult. In the diner, my phone buzzed again. This time, voicemail appeared. I did not listen. Not yet. The waitress came by with the coffee pot. "You waiting on someone?" she asked gently. I looked at the empty seat across from me. For one foolish second, I imagined Margaret there, rolling her eyes at the whole mess, telling me not to let proud people confuse polish with class. "No," I said, "not anymore." She filled my cup anyway. I wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat settle into my fingers. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected anger to shake them, but anger was not what I felt. Clarity was. That morning, at the wedding doors, my son had not forgotten to save me a seat. He had decided I no longer deserved one. The thing about an envelope is that it does not look dangerous. It is just paper folded around other paper. No raised voice, no slammed door. A man can carry one in his jacket pocket and look harmless. That was why I chose it. If I had stood in that doorway and told my son what he had done, people would have remembered an old man making a scene. If I had raised my voice, Claire's family would have called me unstable. Grant Whitmore would have smiled and whispered something about grief making people difficult. I had spent too many years repairing broken systems to waste time kicking the walls. When ductwork fails, you do not argue with the air. You find the blockage. So I left the envelope. Back at Ashford Oaks, Marcia Bell stood near the side hallway with it in her hand while the ceremony began. Wedding planners are trained to prevent disruption. Their profession is built around keeping disasters quiet until the cake is cut. But Marcia was not just a planner. She was a businesswoman who understood documents, signatures, and unpaid balances. She knew my name. She had known it from the emergency conference call 2 weeks earlier, when the venue manager, the caterer, and Claire's mother were speaking in tight, panicked voices because Grant Whitmore's check had bounced for the second time. I had been on that call with Denise Porter. My attorney, Evelyn Whitmore, explained that the bank had made some temporary mistake. Grant blamed a wire delay. The venue manager explained, very politely, that flowers and string quartets did not run on excuses. Then Denise cleared her throat. Mr. Walker's trust will cover the outstanding balance, she said, provided all final invoices are sent through my office. Silence followed. That kind of silence tells you who has money and who has only performed it. Grant thanked me afterward in a voice so stiff it sounded painful. Daniel sent me a text with 3 prayer hand emojis and the words, "You saved us." Dad, I still had that text. Marcia remembered all of it when she held my envelope outside the bridal suite. Inside the room, Claire was waiting with her maid of honor, 2 bridesmaids, and her mother. The ceremony had ended. Guests were moving toward cocktail hour. Cameras were being adjusted. Everyone was still behaving as if the day belonged to perfection. Marcia knocked softly. Claire looked up from a mirror rimmed with little lights. "What is it?" she asked. "Something from Mr. Walker," Marcia said. At first, Claire's face showed annoyance, not fear. To her, I was probably Daniel's difficult father, who had failed to cooperate with the seating plan. One more emotional complication on a day designed to photograph well. "My father-in-law?" Claire asked. Marcia hesitated just enough for Evelyn to notice. "Yes," Marcia said. "From Thomas Walker." Claire held out her hand. I was not there. But Marcia told Denise later that the room changed slowly, the way weather changes before a storm. Claire opened the envelope with one manicured finger and pulled out the first page. It was the final wedding invoice. At the top was the Ashford Oaks logo. Below that were itemized charges: venue rental, catering balance, floral overage, premium bar extension, security, lighting, valet, staff gratuities, late payment penalties. At the bottom, under funding source, was printed, Walker Family Trust, authorized by Thomas E. Walker, trustee. Claire stared at the line. "What is that?" one bridesmaid whispered. Claire did not answer. She turned to the second page. That one was not emotional at all. Legal documents rarely are. They speak in cold sentences because cold sentences are harder to argue with. It was a venue ownership disclosure from Denise Porter's office, confirming that the Walker Family Trust held controlling interest in Ashford Oaks Event Estate. Claire's lips parted. "Why is his name on the venue?" she whispered. Evelyn reached for the paper. Claire pulled it back. Then she read the third page. Denise's letter. It stated that the Whitmore family's final 2 payments had failed to clear. It stated that the event had been within hours of cancellation. It stated that Thomas Walker had personally guaranteed the unpaid balance, so the wedding could proceed without public embarrassment to either family. That was the page that turned her face pale. Not because I had paid. Money can embarrass people, but it does not always change them. No. Claire went pale because she understood sequence. First, I saved the wedding. Then her family hid the debt. Then my son moved me away from the family table, so the people I had rescued would not have to look at me in the photographs. There are truths that do not need commentary. They arrived fully dressed. Daniel came into the bridal suite 30 seconds later, smiling too hard. "Claire, they're ready for the family portraits," he said. "Your dad wants the staircase shot before everyone gets drinks in their hands." Nobody answered. His smile faded. "What's wrong?" Claire lifted the invoice. "Did your father pay for this wedding?" Daniel looked at Marcia first. That was his mistake. Innocent people look at the person asking the question. Guilty people look for the witness. Dad helped with a few things. He said. Marcia's voice was quiet. Mr. Walker covered the balance that kept the event from being canceled. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's not really... Claire cut him off. And you put him at table 19. The room went still. Somewhere below, guests laughed over champagne. A photographer called for the bride's family. A violinist played a melody that suddenly seemed out of place. Claire looked down at the last sheet in her hand. My note, the only part written without legal language. Claire, if this day is full of love, then no document in this envelope will matter. If it is full of appearances, then you should know whose name is holding the room together. Below it, I had written one more line. Margaret would have saved you a seat. Marcia said that was when Claire sat down. Not collapsed, not fainted, just sat down slowly, as if her legs had finally received news her heart already knew. Claire sat in that bridal suite with her dress spread around her like spilled moonlight, holding 3 pieces of paper that weighed more than the entire wedding. Marcia told me later that nobody spoke for several seconds. The bridesmaids looked at each other as if they had accidentally witnessed something private and dangerous. Evelyn Whitmore stood near the champagne bucket, one hand pressed against her necklace, her mouth pulled into a thin line. Daniel was still in the doorway. He looked smaller than he had 30 minutes earlier. That is the strange thing about truth. It does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it walks into a room quietly, places a bill on the table, and lets everybody remember what they pretended not to know. Claire looked at him. You told me your father was only helping with the rehearsal dinner. Daniel rubbed his palms against the sides of his tuxedo pants. It was complicated. No, she said. Her voice was soft, but it had steel under it. Complicated is when the florist brings cream roses instead of white roses. This says his trust kept the venue from canceling. Evelyn stepped forward. Claire, sweetheart, this is not the time. Claire turned toward her mother. Did you know? Evelyn's silence was polished and useless. That was when Grant Whitmore entered the room. He came in holding a glass of bourbon, already annoyed that the wedding schedule was no longer obeying him. Grant was a handsome man in the way expensive tailoring can make almost any man look handsome from a distance. Silver hair, straight white teeth, a watch heavy enough to announce itself. What on earth is taking so long? He said, people are waiting for photographs. Then he saw Claire's face. His smile lost its balance. What happened? Claire held up the letter from Denise Porter's office. Dad, she said, why did Mr. Walker have to save the wedding? Grant's expression changed so fast that even Daniel noticed. First confusion, then calculation, then offense. Because men like Grant often use offense as a smokescreen when facts walk into the room. I don't know what you think you're reading. He said, I'm reading that your checks didn't clear. That was a temporary banking issue. Twice, his jaw tightened. This is absurd. Give me that. He reached for the papers. Claire stepped back. Marcia moved slightly, not enough to interfere, just enough to remind him that there was a witness in the room who knew exactly what those documents were. Grant saw that, too. For the first time all day, he seemed aware that Ashford Oaks was not his stage. It was mine. The truth about Grant was not that he had always been poor. That would have made him simpler. Years earlier, he had been exactly what he claimed to be, a successful developer with bright projects and men who returned his calls quickly. Then interest rates climbed. 2 deals stalled, and a lawsuit from a failed condo project started eating the middle out of his empire. Instead of admitting he was bleeding, he dressed the wound in better suits. Evelyn knew some of it. Not all. Maybe, but enough. Enough to smile harder. Enough to treat appearances like oxygen. Enough to convince herself that one flawless wedding could buy her family another season of respectability. That did not make them innocent. It made them desperate. Desperation with pride is a dangerous chemical. Downstairs, the cocktail hour had begun. Guests stood beneath chandeliers, drinking champagne paid for by the man sitting alone in a diner 6 miles away. They complimented the flowers. They admired the venue. They praised Grant for hosting such a beautiful event, because that was the story he had told them. Grant had built the day on borrowed money, borrowed status, and borrowed generosity. The only thing truly his was the arrogance. Claire lowered her voice. Did Daniel's father pay for the bar package? 2. Nobody answered. That was answer enough. Daniel tried to step toward her. Claire, listen. I was going to explain everything after the honeymoon. Her eyes snapped back to him. After the honeymoon. I didn't want to ruin today. You didn't want to ruin today, she repeated, almost to herself. So you let me humiliate the one man keeping today from falling apart. Daniel flinched. I didn't humiliate him. Marcia, to her credit, said nothing. She did not have to. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Where is he seated? Daniel swallowed. Daniel. Table 19. He said. Grant exhaled sharply. For God's sake. It's a seating chart. Nobody was sent to prison. Claire turned on her father then, and Marcia said the room seemed to get colder. No. Claire said. He was sent away. That word landed. Away. Not moved. Not adjusted. Not accommodated. Away. I was sitting in that diner when Claire reached this part of the story. Though I did not know it yet, I was stirring coffee I had no intention of drinking, watching rain silver the window, trying not to imagine the ceremony. I told myself the envelope had done what it needed to do. It had told the truth. Anything after that belonged to them. But truth rarely stays where you put it. In the bridal suite, Claire read the note again. Margaret would have saved you a seat. She asked Daniel, Who is Margaret? For the first time, my son looked genuinely ashamed. My mother, he said. Claire looked down at her wedding dress, then toward the mirror, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time that day. And the photograph at the front table. Daniel nodded. She died 5 years ago. Claire closed her eyes, and we didn't even save his chair beside her. Daniel said nothing. Grant interrupted, his voice hard. This sentimental nonsense is exactly how men like Walker manipulate people. He wanted attention. He got it. Now let's get this event back under control. That was the wrong thing to say. Claire slowly lifted her head. Men like Walker. Grant pointed toward the documents. Blue-collar millionaires are all the same. They pretend to be humble while buying leverage over everyone around them. Marcia's face hardened. Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Walker never asked for public credit. He asked only that the day proceed without embarrassment to your family. Grant glared at her. You work for the venue. Yes, Marcia said. And the venue answers to ownership. The room became silent again. Grant's bourbon glass lowered an inch. Claire saw it. So did Daniel. There are moments when an entire family myth breaks open from one small sentence. For Claire, that was the sentence. Her father was not the powerful man controlling the room. He was a guest inside a room controlled by the father he had mocked. A knock sounded at the door. The photographer called. Bride's family. We're ready. Claire looked at her father, then at Daniel, then at the empty hallway beyond them. No, she said quietly. We're not ready at all. The reception was supposed to begin at 6 o'clock. By 6:15, guests stood beneath chandeliers with half-empty champagne flutes and polite confusion on their faces. Weddings are strange that way. People will tolerate almost anything if there are enough appetizers, and nobody tells them the truth. Grant Whitmore moved from group to group, laughing too loudly, assuring important men that everything was on schedule. Evelyn stayed close to him, smiling with the exhausted discipline of a woman who had been holding a cracked vase together for years and feared one wrong breath would shatter it. But upstairs, the schedule had already broken. Claire came down the staircase with Daniel beside her. From a distance, they still looked like a beautiful couple. White dress, black tuxedo, soft lights, perfect photograph. But beauty is not the same thing as peace. Daniel kept one hand at Claire's back, guiding a situation that no longer belonged to him. Claire did not lean into him. Marcia directed the photographer toward the family table. That table was beautiful. White roses, crystal glasses. Margaret's photograph sat near the center beside a single candle. And beside that photograph, there was nothing. No chair, no place setting, no sign that the woman in the picture had shared a life with the man who paid for the room. Claire stopped when she saw it. Daniel whispered something. She did not answer. The reception began anyway, because receptions are machines. Guests sat down. Salads appeared. People smiled the careful smiles of those who know something is wrong. I was not there for any of it. I had driven home by then. The rain followed me back to my quiet little house. I hung my suit jacket over a kitchen chair, took Margaret's ring from the pocket. and set it beside her picture. Then, for reasons I still do not like admitting, I turned the frame slightly away from me, not face down. I could not do that to her. Just enough that I did not have to look directly into the eyes of the woman I had promised to stand tall for. I tried. I told the room. The house gave no answer. At Ashford Oaks, Grant rose for the welcome toast. He tapped his knife against a glass until the room quieted. He stood under the warm light like a man born for microphones. Friends, family, honored guests, he began. Tonight, we celebrate not only a marriage, but the joining of two remarkable families. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his plate. Grant went on about legacy, commitment, shared values, and the blessing of generosity. That last word, Marcia later told me, made Claire close her eyes. Then Grant lifted his glass. To Daniel and Claire, he said, and to family, the foundation of everything. That was when Claire stood, not quickly, not dramatically. She simply rose and reached for the microphone. Grant smiled uncertainly. Claire, sweetheart, I wasn't quite finished. I know, she said. The room gave a nervous laugh. It died fast. Claire turned toward the guests. Her hands trembled, but her voice held. I need to say something before we continue. Daniel reached for her wrist. Claire. She pulled away, not harshly, but clearly. There is a chair at the family table that should not be empty, she said. 200 people became very still. Claire looked toward Margaret's photograph. And there is a man missing from this room, who should have been treated with more respect than we gave him today. Grant's face hardened. Claire swallowed. I am not going to discuss private family matters in front of all of you. That would only make a wrong thing worse. But I will say this. This wedding happened because someone chose to be generous without asking to be seen. And we repaid that generosity by making him feel invisible. The room stayed silent. That was all she said publicly. No invoices. No public trial. No microphone call in front of cheering guests. Real shame does not need a stage bigger than one honest sentence. Claire handed the microphone back to Marcia. Then she turned to Daniel. We need to call him. Daniel looked pale. Now, she said. But not like this. She nodded toward the reception hall. Not as a performance. Marcia led them through a side door into a small office behind the kitchen. The kind of room where venues keep spare candles, clipboards, stain remover, and emergency sewing kits. Claire shut the door. Daniel stood with his phone in his hand for several seconds before dialing. My phone rang on the kitchen table at 6:48. I looked at the screen. Daniel. For a moment, I considered letting it go. Then I thought of Margaret's photograph turned slightly away from me. And I answered, Yes, son. His voice came through thin and tired. Dad. I heard muffled music behind him. Then a door closing. Quieter now. Claire is here, he said. Then Claire's voice came through, shaky but clear. Mr. Walker, this is Claire. I know. I read your envelope. I assumed you might. Her breath caught. I didn't know everything. I looked at Margaret's ring beside my coffee cup. No, I said, but you knew enough. There was a pause. Not defensive. Not angry. Yes, she whispered. I did. That mattered. Then Daniel came back on the line. Dad, I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean for it to feel like this. I closed my eyes. My son was still apologizing for the pain reaching the surface, not for the choice that caused it. Daniel, I said quietly, you did not make a seating mistake. You made a choice. No one spoke. You put your mother's picture at a table and removed the man who loved her for 41 years. You let strangers drink on my dime while I was sent to the back like a problem to hide. Dad, I am not finished. The words came out calm. That made them heavier. I did not leave because I wanted to punish you. I left because I finally understood the room had already made its decision. Daniel's voice cracked. Can you come back? I looked around my kitchen. The old table. Margaret's ring. The photograph I had been too hurt to face. No, I said. Not tonight. Then I said the final thing I needed my son to understand. Tonight, you should sit at that family table and feel the empty chair you created. I ended the call before he could turn my pain into another discussion. Back at Ashford Oaks, Marcia quietly placed a chair beside Margaret's photograph. Nobody sat in it, and that empty chair said more than any toast ever could. The next morning, Daniel came to my house alone. I saw his car pull into the driveway just after 8. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the yard wet and the sky pale. I was at the kitchen sink when his headlights swept across the hydrangeas Margaret had planted years before. For a moment, I did not move. A father's first instinct is stubborn. Even after humiliation, even after hurt, even after hearing his own son choose appearances over blood, some old part of me still wanted to open the door before he knocked. I did not. I dried the cup, set it in the cabinet, and waited. 3 knocks came, careful ones. I opened the front door. Daniel stood on the porch in the same suit pants from the wedding, his white shirt wrinkled, his tie gone, his hair flattened on one side like he had slept badly. He looked 34 and 16 at the same time. "Dad," he said. "Daniel." He looked past me toward the kitchen table where Margaret's photograph sat beside her ring. I had turned the frame back before sunrise. It took me 20 minutes to do it. That sounds foolish, but grief makes small actions heavy. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. He entered slowly, as if the house might reject him. Daniel had grown up running through these rooms, slamming doors, dropping baseball gloves in the hallway. Now he moved like a guest. Maybe that was proper. Maybe that was sad. Some things can be both. We sat at the kitchen table. For a while, neither of us spoke. The furnace clicked on. A bird scratched at the feeder outside the window. Ordinary sounds have a way of making painful moments feel more real. Finally, Daniel said, "Claire stayed at the hotel last night." I nodded. "She's angry. She should be." He flinched. At me, at everyone who helped build that room, and then pretended not to see who was missing from it. He looked down at his hands. They were soft hands, office hands. Nothing wrong with that. I had worked hard so my son could have soft hands, but I had not worked so he could have a soft spine. Grant was pressuring me. He said, there it was, not the apology, the explanation. I let him continue. He said the investors were watching. He said if the wedding looked disorganized, the development role would fall apart. He said your truck, your suit, the whole blue-collar thing, it would make people ask questions. Daniel rubbed his face. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man explaining why he was willing to sell his father for a job title. His eyes flashed, just for a second. That's not fair. No, I said. It is accurate. Fair would have been saving me a chair. He opened his mouth, then closed it. That was the first honest thing he did that morning. I was scared. He said eventually, of Grant, of losing the life I thought I was about to have. I nodded slowly. That is closer to the truth. Tears came into his eyes then. Quiet ones. The kind men try to blink away because we are taught early that sorrow should have manners. I'm sorry, he said. I waited. He looked at the photograph of Margaret. Not because it blew up. Not because Claire found out. I'm sorry because I knew it was wrong before you even got there. I sent that text because I already knew you were going to be hurt, and I wanted you to make it easy for me. There it was. Not a perfect apology. Not a polished one. A real one. I looked at Margaret's ring on the table between us. I brought that yesterday to give to you. I said. Daniel stared at it. She wanted you to have it someday. Not because it was expensive. It isn't. She wanted you to remember what marriage is supposed to mean. Showing up. Protecting each other. Telling the truth when lying would be easier. He reached toward the ring, then stopped himself. Can I still have it? Not yet. His face folded. I did not enjoy saying it. That mattered. If punishment starts to taste good, a man should check his own heart. Daniel, I am not cutting you out of my life. I said, you are my son. That does not change. But access to my generosity is going to change. He nodded slowly. The remaining wedding gifts are canceled. I continued. The honeymoon upgrade. The down payment help. The business line of credit you asked me to co-sign. All of it? Dad, no. He went silent. I spent years mistaking rescue for love. I said, that was my mistake. I thought if I made life easier for you, you would feel secure enough to become good. But comfort does not create character. Choices do. He stared at the table. If Claire wants to speak to me, I will hear her. She owned more truth in 5 minutes last night than you did all day. But trust will not be rebuilt because people are embarrassed. It will be rebuilt slowly, if it is rebuilt at all. Daniel swallowed. Are you still my father? That question hurt more than I expected. Always? I said, but I am done proving it to people who hide me when the room gets expensive. He covered his face with one hand. For the first time since he was a child, I let him cry without trying to fix it. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. The grass was damp, and the air smelled like rain and cut leaves. Margaret's headstone sat under a maple tree, simple and gray. I placed one white rose beside it. Well, I said softly, the wedding was beautiful. A breeze moved through the branches, not in the way we hoped. I stood there a long while. I told her Daniel had growing up to do. I told her I probably did, too. Then I touched the stone and walked back to my truck. I still love my son. I always will. But I learned something that weekend. A father can pay for the room, build the table, and save every seat. But he should never have to beg to be called family. If this story made you think of a chair you saved for someone, or a chair someone refused to save for you, sit with that feeling honestly. Share your story when you are ready. Someone listening may need to know they are not alone. And if these quiet stories matter to you, stay with us for the next one.